This is Dr. Peter Grinspoon. Thanks for listening to my YouTube channel. We're going to be talking about my Substack today, Grinspoon on Drugs. And the topic today is a little bit off drugs and more towards addiction. It's on gambling addiction. I've been really fascinated by gambling addiction and the other behavioral addictions like over shopping, overeating, overusing the internet, porn addiction, kleptomania. Before we get started, if you can go to the bottom right of your screen and just subscribe to my channel. It's free. And then you could have like free access to all of this great content we do, not just gambling addiction today. So today's topic is gambling addiction. I was curious what there is gambling addiction. People talk about eating addiction. They talk about food addiction. They talk about internet addiction. But are these actually addictions? Or are we just using the terminology addiction as a shortcut? Interestingly, gambling addiction is considered to be addiction by the addiction psychiatrists. The other addictions that I just listed, which certainly will be eventually considered addictions like overeating, internet use, porn addiction, aren't actually considered as quote unquote addictions yet, but they will be. It's all a work in progress. The gambling addiction overlaps greatly with regular addiction to drugs. When I was addicted to opiates 18 years ago, I had no control over my use. I was impulsively using drugs, and my whole conception of like consequences was distorted. I'd be focused much more in the short term, like, can I not feel sick, than the long term, like, I'm going to flunk a drug test and then not go back to medicine. And it's the same with gambling addiction. People get overwhelmed by it. And it's the same parts of our brain. If you do functional neuroimaging, they see the dopamine lighting up. Just with when I was addicted to opiates, dopamine would explode when I took an Oxycontin. The same for people who are unfortunately addicted to gambling. Give me more dopamine. It just from the slot machine or now with the stock market, actually, it's just incredibly dangerous to gambling. And as a society, we're making gambling more excessive. With stocks, it's very easy to trade. Now there's online sports betting. The people who are most susceptible to gambling addiction are like young men and veterans. And these are the ones who are getting totally swept up in these sports betting addictions. So I'm really, really worried about us creating an epidemic of gambling addiction. All the people who are susceptible, just like with drugs, if you're susceptible and then you flood them with access to drugs, you create more addiction. And I'm not a big believer in like the war on drugs and focusing on like trying to remove the supply because that's impossible. It's much better to deal with addiction by education and regulation. But if you put it in people's faces, people who are susceptible are going to get addicted. Now, people who are addicted to gambling have a very, very low quality of life. It's a very easy way to get into poverty. It's associated with addiction, with depression, with anxiety, with personality disorders. People lose their savings, they lose their houses, they steal from friends. It's really, really miserable. And what are the treatments for gambling addiction? Interestingly, the treatments for gambling addiction overlap with the treatments for regular addiction. Psychotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, learn other ways to be in the world without necessarily needing that buzz of dopamine. If you can get your dopamine from walking in the woods with a friend, you don't need your dopamine for addiction. So a lot of it is psychotherapy to try to learn other ways of dealing with a low mood. I mean, when people have low moods, they gamble, they shop, they eat. And if we could just cope with our lower moods in a healthier way, exercise, adequate nutrition, adequate sleep, finding fun activities with friends, we're less susceptible for any type of addiction, being gambling, drugs, or any of these other things. They're also experimenting with drugs for gambling addiction, but we are not there yet. There are no FDA-approved drugs. They're studying the same drugs, interestingly, that we use to lower regular addiction, like blocking the opiate receptors or an SSRI, Zoloft or Prozac, so that people feel happier. And then finally, there's self-help. Self-help groups are a huge part of treatment for addiction. With gambling addiction, you have Gamblers Anonymous. There are hundreds of chapters of Gamblers Anonymous in every single state. Now, I'm a little bit dubious of the 12-step groups like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous because they are a little bit weird and cult-like. I think it's better to have Gamblers Anonymous than nothing because it helps people, but we ideally should come up, just like with addiction, with these social support groups that don't have this whole bizarre cult-like religious overhang. Anyways, if you or your loved one is addicted to gambling, very important if your loved one is, because if you don't protect your resources, I've seen stories about people losing their houses because their relative gambles all their money away. If you or your loved one has an addiction to gambling, I would recommend getting professional help right away, because this is an addiction. It's an incredibly destructive addiction, and it could really, really ruin your finances and your quality of life. Thank you for listening to Grinspoon on Drugs today. Please check out my Substack, and please check out my YouTube channel.